So our passage today is found in the book of Romans. We're looking at Romans chapter 2, verses 12 to the end, verse 28. We've been talking about the book of Romans, and we've been talking through Paul writing it. We've talked about Paul pointing out that the nature itself has revealed God to us, and so that we are without excuse. Last week we talked about judgment and how, as people, we naturally judge other people, and in doing so, we recognize that there is a law that is greater than us, that is beyond us, a law that we should all be following. And so it is with that idea of God revealing the law to us, God giving us a law, and just by nature us recognizing that there is a law that we continue with this idea of the law. And I actually took notes today. Let's see if I can follow them. All right? But we're going to read Romans chapter 2, verses 12 to the end. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. And all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them. This will take place on the day when God will judge men's secret through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and brag about your relationship to God, if you know His will and approve of what is superior, because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of infants, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who brag about the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Circumcision has value if you observe the law, but if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. If those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you, who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, are a lawbreaker. A man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a man's praise is not from men, but from God. All right? That's a lot to take in, but really it boils down to those first 3 or 4 verses, and the rest kind of expounds upon those, which is why we're taking this large chunk as though it were one chunk. So we have this first idea: all who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. Right? We recognize this idea that if you perish without the law, there is no hope. Right? That's kind of what it's saying. If you perish apart from the law, you perish apart from the law. You're dead. Why? Because there is no way, no redemption apart from the law. There is no way of taking back the wrongs we have done. As we've discussed in the past, and we'll discuss again in the next couple of weeks, all of us have done something wrong. There's not a human being out there other than Jesus Christ himself who has not done something wrong. And so without the law, if you perish without it, you perish. And that's just the way things work. But then he has this next statement. He says, but you guys, you who are under the law, you'll be judged by the law. All right? And then there comes two solutions there. All right? And we have to understand the law to some extent. And so if we're judged by the law, that means we have to pay the penalty that the law calls for. And God kind of made it kind of simple. We can go all the way back to the Garden of Eden to figure out what the penalty for breaking the law is. Because he gave one law there. He said, do not touch, do not eat. He didn't say do not touch. He said, do not eat of the fruit of the tree in the center of the garden, or you shall surely die. Okay? He made it very simple. You break my law, you die. Well, it turns out when you study Exodus, when you study Deuteronomy, those are the places where we find the giving of the law. In fact, Deuteronomy literally means the second law. It's the second giving of the law. Right? We find that there's one real penalty, one real punishment for breaking the law. And that is death. Right? So you got this option. You perish without the law, or you pay the penalty under the law, and that penalty is death. Right? And so you say, but you said there are two things with the law. Well, see, the law has a statement. It says, look, I recognize that you are going to fail, that you are going to stumble, that you are going to fall. So here's what we're going to do. If you sin, and there are lots of details on, if you do this sin, this is the what you bring. If you do this sin, this is what you bring. If you do that sin, this is what you bring. All right? And most of us, we don't ever really care about those details. But in all of it is, you bring this animal and you kill it. All right? For some of the minor sins, you might only be bringing 2 turtle doves. Right? You may be bringing a sheep, a goat, a lamb, all the way up to the calf. Right? You bring the animal in, you kill it. That's the redemption part of the law. And so you sin apart from the law, you perish. There is no sacrifice, right? Until we come to the law, and the law says, look, if you sin, the penalty is death, or you bring, and let something else die in your place. Now, the reality was that the bloods of goats and sheep, they never saved anyone. We find that in the book of Hebrews. It said, look, that's not what God wanted from us. That was just to point to the blood of Christ that would be shed for us. That sacrifice of Christ, that has always been the hope in the redemption that was found in the law. That only through that, only through accepting his sacrifice, accepting him as a Savior, do we have any hope to not be perished. Well, you can't be perished, right? It's not really a passive verb. Active verb. It's a passive. To not perish, right? Someday I'll learn the English language. And so Paul is kind of bringing us to that thought to our attention. That look, with the law, you have this way out. Without it, there is no way out. So he goes on. He goes on in verse 13. He says, for it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. And we're going to touch on this, but we'll come back to it. So really he says, look, it's great that you guys know the law, but until you start actually doing it, it doesn't matter. Right? Until you offer the sacrifice, there was no redemption. Until you brought your sheep, your goat, your whatever it was to the priest, so the priest could take it to the altar, you still had that sin on you. Right? Until you come to Christ, it doesn't matter. It's not enough to know about it. You have to do it. And we're going to come back to this. But then he goes on in verse 14 and he says, look, Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature the things required by the law, they are a law for themselves. And we get to this part and we go, what in the world is he talking about? All right? And so we really start asking this question, who are these Gentiles he's talking about? And really, when you think about Gentiles, that term Gentiles means anybody who's not Jewish. All right? And so we could do a little poll here. If you're Jewish, go ahead and raise your hands. Right? So none of us are Jewish. So we're Gentiles. So we could be looking at this group of Gentiles and saying, well, these are just the people who do good things, right? The people who by nature are friendly. The people who by nature don't steal. The people who by nature don't murder and all that stuff. But, we always come back to it that, by nature we sin. By nature we do something that's wrong. And this is why he says in verse 15, since they show the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing. And we can stop there. Our thoughts accusing, because remember, he's talked about this in chapter 1. That by nature we know that there's a God. By nature we know that there's a right and wrong. And we know things about God. And we talked about this last week. By nature, when we judge others, right? And so our own thoughts accuse us. Gentiles who do the law, their thoughts accuse them. But the reality is, I think when he's talking about Gentiles who do the law, he's talking about those of us who have come to Christ. Those of us who have accepted the sacrifice. Because he finishes that with, even defending them. Because there is no defense except the blood of the Lamb. There is no defense for our sins apart from Christ. And so we, as believers, we are those Gentiles who are doing the law. The Gentiles who say, look, this is what God said to do. We're going to try to do that. We recognize we're going to fail at that. And so we give it over to Jesus. Right? We are those Gentiles. And we become that law in of ourselves. We share the law with those around us. This was the job of the Jewish people. Their job was to teach the world, was to share the law of Christ with the world. Yeah, they didn't have the law of Christ per se. They had the law of God that pointed to Christ. Right? And that's where what he gets into in verse 17. Now, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and brag about your relationship to God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law. That was the Jewish people. Right? They were given the law. They were given a special relationship with God. You will be my people and I will be your God if you do the things that I command you. Right? Jesus says something similar. You shall be my friends if you do what I command you. Right? We've been given the law. Originally, it was the Jews who were given the law. And they recognized they had this special relationship with God because of it. And they said, hey, look how grand we are. We have God, the God. Not just a God, but we have the God. And we have his law handed to us. They got it on stone tablets. God wrote it with his own finger. I want to see that handwriting. It's got to be a lot neater than mine, right? But they were given the law. They understood. They had this special relationship. They had a task. Their job was to share that with the world. Their job was to be the exemplars, the example of what God's people are, of what God's people do, of how to come to Christ, or how to come to God. Right? And he says, look, that's great that you had that. But all of this stuff he has if you consider yourself great, if you look at yourself like this because of this, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, And he goes on and says, because you have the law, which is the embodiment of knowledge and truth. And so we can say, look, that's what the Jewish people were supposed to do. That's what they're supposed to do, and we find that they weren't doing it. That's what the rest of this passage is about, really. You didn't do it. You thought you were the teachers, and yet you're not teaching yourself. You're not doing it. Right? And we can say, yeah, but that's for the Jewish people. Right? Well, the reality is that we now, as Christians, we as believers, we have that which is greater than the law. We are called to share the gospel with the people around us. We're called to give light in dark places, to be light in dark places. We're called to give sight to the blind. And it may not be physical, actual sight, but we're called spiritual blind. We're called to go in and share that news, to share that which is greater than the law. And so these questions that he asks, they're really questions that we have to answer ourselves. And that notion of, you know what, we know about it, we hear about it, but are we doers of it? Are we obedient to it ourselves? Because he says the law was the embodiment of knowledge and truth. Well, that's God. The law was the embodiment of God in some sense. The Spirit comes and he teaches us all knowledge and truth. The Father gives us all knowledge and truth. Jesus was the Spirit of truth. I am the truth, he said. We have that, and our job is to share it with the world. But if we're not doing it, how does that work? The whole purpose of the law was to point us to Christ. That's why the law existed. He says so there in Galatians, and I put that in the bulletin. Galatians chapter 3:24, therefore the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. It was taught to me this way. We were given the law so that we would realize that none of us can measure up. So that we would realize Romans 3:10, that there's none righteous, no, not one. That we would realize Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Remember 2 weeks ago when we read off that list, disobedient to parents? And I say, look, I can't imagine any one of us who wasn't disobedient to our parent at one point. I have 3 children. They all manage to do it at least once a day. I love them dearly. And I'm going to tell you that I was probably worse than they are. So we recognize that. That's why the law was there, was to show us we're all sinners. That's what the law was there, to show us this. It was a tutor. And we, as the bearers of the law, we, as the bearers of that which is greater than the law, are supposed to be tutors to the world. We're supposed to be the teachers that point to Christ. But there's a problem when we don't do the things we're called to do, when we don't follow the law, when we are disobedient. And when we sit there and we go, well, nobody's perfect, so it's okay that I'm disobedient. You see, people look at us and they go, well, then why do I need to do it? I was having a conversation with my cooperating teacher during my student teaching, and he was saying, it always perplexes me that kids want to be like the people that are put in authority over them. Whether we think about it or not, we tend to look at them and hold them up, our teachers, as examples. And they say this to the teachers. They say, look, you got to be professional everywhere you go. And some teachers recognize this. You got to be professional, and nowadays on your Facebook site, because the kids may somehow find you on Facebook. Well, I think that's great if they find me on Facebook. They're going to find the messages, the sermons. most of the time. They're going to find some that'd be great. But we want our kids to be like that. Well, it turns out that most of the teachers I grew up knowing, we knew what they were like when they weren't in school, and they weren't like what they told us to be like. And so most of the kids said, well, if they're not acting like that, why should we act like that? Half of my teachers growing up were lushes. They liked to drink alcohol. We knew which bars they went to. It was a big school, and we kind of knew each teacher. This is where this one goes. This is where this one goes. Oh yeah, we see them there quite often when we're driving by. Is that what we want our kids to grow up to be like? Well, that's what the kids said. Well, if they're drinking, then I may as well drink. If they're doing this, I may as well do this. You know, what kind of language do you use? Your kid hears you swear, and you say, don't swear. Your kid goes, well, you swear. Why shouldn't I swear? Smoking. That was a big one when we were growing up. Parents who smoked, and they'd tell their kids, you don't ever start this. Well, if you're doing it, of course I'm going to do it. Right? Because kids do what you do. They don't do what you say, they do what you do. If we are the tutors of that which is greater than the law, the people around us are going to see us and they're going to do the things that we do, not the things that we say. And if we start walking around disobeying the law, we are not really teaching them the law. If we're preaching against stealing and we steal, well, they'd say, well, if they steal, it's okay if we steal. If they don't obey the government, we don't need to obey the government. If they don't do this, then we don't need to do it. And we see how that works. And it ought not to be so, right? That's what Paul's saying here, is that look, it goes beyond just hearing the law. It goes beyond knowing it. It goes beyond telling people about it. You got to live it. Right? You got to live it out. And not just every once in a while. You got to live it out all the time. You got to live it out all the time. Obedience all the time. And then he's got that bit at the end, verses 25 to 28, where he starts talking about circumcision. Because circumcision, that was a sign that you were under the law. That was an outward appearance thing. It's not enough to be obedient when people can see you. You have to be obedient inside where they can't see you. Because it turns out that we may think that our masks are great. We may think that, oh man, people can't see what's... It turns out that what's inside almost always comes out. And people can see the little things. They can see, oh, wait, no. That internal thing, that's real. And the reality is, when we come to judgment, those secret things, it says in verse 16, God will judge men's secrets through Jesus Christ. It's the inside where obedience starts. It's not, you know what? I'll be obedient on the outside, but inside I'm saying, no, I'm not doing this. I can think of times as a kid where my parents said, go do this. I'm going to pick on Daniel. It's easier because I can remember when a specific time he's done this. Sarah says, go do your math. And Daniel goes and sits down to do his math. And inside, Daniel said, I'm not doing my math. And it's very obvious 4 hours later that he's not doing his math. Outwardly, yeah, he's got the book there and he's writing stuff on the paper. But inwardly, he's doing everything he can to not do his math. And when you look at the paper afterwards, you go, 5 plus 5 is 2? Right? And yeah, I probably shouldn't pick on Daniel all the time, but you can see that image there of we do the same thing. Our obedience cannot just be an outward obedience. It needs to be an inward obedience. If we are to be the people that God has called us to be, we need to obey Him inwardly. Because we are the tutors. We are the ones who have been called to share the light with the world. It does us no benefit until we internalize the obedience, until we start living what God has called us to do. Because the reality is, if we live without the law, we perish without the law. If we live under the law, we're judged by the law. And so we should follow it. We should obey it. We should obey Him. Not because we have to, but because it's inside of us, because we want to, because we love Him, because we do have a special relationship. Will you bow with me in prayer?